All right, P.Z. Myers is a biologist at the University of Minnesota Morris with a special interest in developmental biology and evolution. He's been battling creationists and Bible wallopers and the internet since 1993. I love that, by the way. And has gotten slightly curmudgeonly about it all. The blog Pharyngula is his outlet for venting his fury and faith, stupidity, and injustice on occupation, which somehow led him to being named American Humanist of the Year in 2009. And International Humanist by 2011 by the IEH, the International Humanist and Ethical Union. He's confident that science is the only tool we have for reaching new knowledge, and he regards faith and ignorance as vices and finds happiness with his family. There's no question about that. Here's PZ.
Okay. Okay, so what am I talking about today? Well, this is complicated. As was mentioned in the introduction, I spent a lot of time bashing creationists and religious people and things like that. And I have to take a moment today to bash a few science defenders. There's a pet peeve I have, and what it is things like people who announce something as a fact, as a truth proved by evolution, like, did you know that women are inferior to men? Evolution proves it. That really gets my goat. Okay, that's something that annoys me greatly, and it's because a lot of people have a very poor understanding of what evolution is or how it works. They've missed out on the premises, and they get it all wrong, and it leads them to faulty conclusions. So I'm going to do a little evolutionist bashing today. Does that sound fun? Let's see, is this going to work? Yes, it's going to work. Okay, but first I have to mention, before I start bashing evolution, let's get my credentials out of the way. I am pro-evolution, okay? I love evolution. The fact that I'm going to argue about a few things doesn't mean I disagree with the idea. And I have testimonials to prove it. So there is the Discovery Institute saying I am among the most prominent Darwinists. There you go. Creation Science Evangelism. I'm a militant Darwinism atheist. Kent Hovind says you seem to love to promote your religion of evolutionism in class. And Conservapedia says I'm really fat. You can't beat this, okay? So I have the cred. No argument there. So what do I want to deal with? Well, there's some facts about evolution that a lot of people aren't clear on. Most people have a very simple idea of evolution, right? And not here, of course. You guys, you know what you're doing, so I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, right? Right. Many people have this idea that evolution is this progressive process where there's this thing called natural selection that produces adaptations, and those adaptations lead to ever better and better forms, and we eventually culminate in human beings, the pinnacle of, instead of creation, the pinnacle of evolution. This is false. That's not how it works. That evolution is actually a much more complicated process than that. What I quote here is from the standard textbook in evolution. If you are in college and you take an evolutionary biology course, this is the textbook you will probably read. So this is the established sort of baseline for what we understand about evolution. And the author is saying it's important to recognize that natural selection is not synonymous with evolution. So that's the first thing I want to make clear to everybody. Evolution can occur by processes other than natural selection. Natural selection isn't everything, especially genetic drift. So genetic drift is this stochastic process that by chance produces lots of variations in populations, and is probably the major contributor to evolution, not natural selection. Drift produces all the variation that exists in populations, and then selection can step in and favor certain subsets of that population. But the variation itself is a product largely of drift. So natural selection can occur without any evolutionary change, is another important concept. Natural selection is a conservative force. Most of what's going on in natural selection is limiting the variation in a population. It's selecting for a certain subset. One of the things we look for as a signal for natural selection occurring in genomes is we look for a reduction in variation compared to what we'd expect by pure chance. So natural selection, conservative, limits things. Drift is what's producing all the variation in a population. Okay, here's another author. So I'm just backing up what I say here by a little bit of credentialism here. Michael Lynch is a prominent scientist who's done a number of really interesting things on genomic evolution. And what he's explaining here is the same thing. That Darwin explained one force. All credit to him. This was an important breakthrough, that Darwin recognized this idea of natural selection. We have lots of mathematical models explaining this. We understand natural selection fairly well. But he's pointing out that there are these three other sources that are also very important in evolution that often get neglected. One is mutation. That simple mutation is churning up your genomes and producing all kinds of variations in populations. Each and every one of you human beings, you are all human beings here today, right? You human beings were born with about 100 to 150 novel mutations relative to your parents. You aren't simply the admixture of your mom and dad. There's also 100 mutations. That's tiny compared to the 3 billion nucleotides you've got. But still, there's novelty that's introduced with every newborn individual. And it's been quantified. Another important thing is recombination. You should know this too, that when you produce a child, that child isn't simply a blend of mom and dad. Otherwise, all our kids would look the same, sort of a hybrid me and Mary, which would be weird. What there is recombination, where there's a random mixture of attributes from one parent and from the other parent. So you get some novelty right there. Recombination is an important source of new phenotypes in populations. Every one of you looks different from both your mom and your dad. That's the way it works. And again, we mentioned genetic drift. So like I said, it ensures that gene frequencies will deviate a bit from generation to generation, independent of other forces. It's just pure chance. Each of your kids, for instance, is the outcome of a little lottery where certain genes on the father's side, certain genes on the mother's side get picked by chance and mixed together, and that produces genetic drift as well as new forms. Okay, so you understand these basics, right? So here's just a little summary of the things that when students take evolutionary biology from me, I expect them to come out knowing. So evolution is more than just selection. It includes mutation, recombination, and drift. Natural selection has a cost. I haven't talked about that. That takes a little math to understand. But think of it this way. If you're going to have natural selection, that means that there has to be some penalty to those that don't meet the criteria. They can die, or they fail to reproduce or something. So every time you talk about, well, natural selection produced the elegant shape of my nose, that's implying that a bunch of potential individuals or other individuals in history died because their nose wasn't as nice as mine. Or more likely, they couldn't get mates, right? Yeah, I could believe that, but no, that it implies that there's a cost to this. And if there's a cost, there's a limit to how much a population can bear. So we know you can't just use natural selection as a magic wand and say, poof, this produces this particular trait. Populations have a substantial amount of genetic variation. We aren't all clones of one another. Just look around the room at each other. You notice we don't all look alike. Okay, you're all Canadians, and you're all kind of white. Yeah, okay, there's a fair amount of similarity there. But even within that, there's quite a bit of variation. So populations vary in their individuals. So that's another important property. And most of that variation is neutral or nearly neutral. You're all alive, right? You didn't die because you didn't have my nose. So this is saying that most of the variation we see here isn't going to make a significant effect on your life. It's just part of the background variation that makes for a rich population. So this, again, you don't argue, well, you look like that, and you look like that, and you look like that because natural selection has made you that way. No, that just doesn't work. And finally, that last point. Again, this takes a little math to get through, but most mutations have a threshold for an effect. That if there is this chance jitter, this background noise of genetic drift, the only way selection can work is if an effect is so significant that it produces a greater effect than the background noise. So this should make sense. If you've got a lot of static hiss and the music isn't any louder than the hiss, you don't hear the music, right? You just hear noise. You have to have a certain amplitude. So this is saying that there's a lot of variation that simply is invisible to selection. Nothing is going to select for it. It's just there, which is a great thing. Look at you, all so different. It's charming, right? Okay. Now, though, this leads to some problems from people who don't understand those basic concepts. I run into this all the time. This is just one example. Has anybody heard the phrase cultural Marxism before? Oh, a few in the back. Oh, yeah, okay. I see a Minnesotan back there. Sure, okay. Americans have heard this. Cultural Darwinism is a new watchword you should pay attention to. When you hear somebody use the word cultural Marxist, they're a fucking racist, okay? Plain and simple. They're not going to use profanity or some four-letter word or some word beginning with N or anything like that anymore. They're going to go under the radar by using this phrase, cultural Marxism. And what it is this is an argument I get many times, is that when you look at race, for instance, creationists say that evolution is a social construct and it's not biologically real, which actually creationists don't say. But okay, they say that these guys will say this. Then what they do is they say that people who argue that race is a social construct, that it doesn't have a strong biological foundation, something like natural selection, those are liberal creationists, he says. And of course, Charles Darwin, they say, he was not at all a cultural Marxist because he was a racist pure through, is their defense of this idea. So you'll get this fairly often, at least when you're like I am and making noise on the internet and talking to racists and telling them that they're full of shit. Anyway, so watch for this. You'll also hear another phrase which sounds so good. It sounds like something positive. And that phrase is HBD, or human biological diversity. We all like diversity, right? Those of us who are all for social justice and progressive and liberal think diversity is a great thing. We want to promote more diversity in society. We want to give everyone an equal chance. These people have perverted the concept. For them, human biological diversity refers to the fact that there are races, not individuals, but whole races that have distinctly different properties, and that we should treat members of these races in particular ways. And it's not just races, as that first panel shows you, it's also about feminism. Women have certain biological properties that make their brains work in particular ways that makes them unsuited for jobs like being in the military or being engineers or being scientists. So it's not just using these misconceptions about evolution and science to argue for racism, it's also arguing for sexism. It's kind of amazing stuff. And they will sort of sanctimoniously cloak themselves in the mantle of Charles Darwin in order to make this case. It's dreadfully dishonest. You'll also notice there on the right what is cultural Marxism. It's white disposition. It's mass third world immigration, a hot button issue right now, of course, and anti-white affirmative action. You don't get any of that in Canada, right? Yeah. that this is, again, using the science of evolution to justify what are basically racist ideas. And it drives me nuts, because as I said earlier, there are all these other processes that drive evolution. It's not just natural selection. A person is not black or a woman because natural selection honed them to a particular role. Most of those variations we see are chance derivatives. They're the result of accidents. And they're just background noise in the genetics of life. Okay, and this has been getting mainstream more and more. I don't know if you've talked about it up here, but Nicholas Wade, who was a prominent science reporter for the New York Times, quit his job to write a book called A Troublesome Inheritance, which was about scientific racism. Kind of appalling, I know. This book has been ripped apart all over the place by lots of anthropologists and scientists and geneticists and biologists. But I just include one example of here of the kind of thing he says. So populations that live at high altitudes like Tibetans represent another adaptation to extreme environments. So living in a thin atmosphere. The adaptation of Jews to capitalism is another such evolutionary process. You know, I read that and I could not believe that this book actually got published and got good reviews from racist outlets like Republicans. But this is the kind of thing they do. And I highlight that word, their adaptation, because the foundation of their argument is to say that all the features that we see in individuals are the product of adaptive processes. And so if they are adaptive processes, there has to be one version of that feature that is the best, and others that are inferior and being gradually selected against. So yeah, if you've got Tibetans living at high altitude, there has to have been selection for changes in their circulatory system, their respiratory system to cope with that high altitude, and I could accept that. There is even evidence of biological differences between Tibetans who've lived at high altitude for a long time and lowlanders. I will accept that. However, if you're going to argue that I have this stereotype that Jews like money, and because I have this stereotype, and because then Jews like money, there must be an adaptive reason for this. That's a perversion of evolutionary biology. That's just appalling that they try to get away with this. I'll also mention that this is a quote from another author, Michael Levin, who said similar sorts of things. So the violence displayed by American blacks was adaptive in ancestral environments. You know, I don't believe that. I believe Africans were just as emphatic in the support of cooperation among each other as white people, that there was no selection for violence in any human population at any time in history. That this is pure bunk that he's producing here. But once again, he's using that word, adaptive, 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 adaptive. Adaptive has become the mantra of the anti-science right wing. Any difference must have been adaptive. Therefore, we should support making sure that black people just have custodial positions instead of working in administration. There's lots of arguments like that out there. Another case I want to talk about is evolutionary psychology. Those who read my blog know I've got a little thing about evolutionary psychology. I really, really detest evolutionary psychology, but you see it all over the place. Evolutionary psychology has become a very popular subject in lots of pop science, pop culture, women's magazines, anything that's got kind of a superficial approach to the real world just loves evolutionary psychology, because what evolutionary psychology does is takes behaviors that you take for granted, and like Nicholas Wade, you know, you could think of, for instance, this idea that Jews like money, a stereotype. Another one is women like to shop. Anything like that, and then you wrap it up in a scientific explanation, usually prefaced by some kind of adaptive explanation for it. So here are the creators of evolutionary psychology. These are a couple of scientists who came up with the whole idea of evolutionary psychology, established it as a discipline, Tooby and Cosmides. This is their definition. It's not my definition, it's their definition. So they say it's simply psychology that is informed by the additional knowledge that evolutionary biology has to offer, in the expectation that understanding the process that designed the human mind will advance the discovery of its architecture. I would agree 100% with that the mind, the brain, is a product of evolutionary processes. I don't think anybody here would disagree with me on that. But as I told you earlier, there's more to evolution than adaptation, right? That a lot of the things in our brain are the product of chance. They weren't selected for. Some were, some definitely were, but the hard part of doing this kind of evolutionary brain science is sorting out the adaptive phenomena from the chance phenomena. And in something as complicated as a brain, that's really, really hard to do. Okay, so that's their definition. Here's another definition. Evolutionary psychology is a narrowly circumscribed adaptationist research program which regards the human mind as an integrated collection of cognitive, it's the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, they're getting wordy. Anyway, you get the idea. It's an adaptationist program. It says, we're going to look at the brain as the product of a set of adaptations. The cognitive mechanisms are supposed to be adaptations. Look, adaptation all over the place. I read this stuff and it just drives me nuts because when I read real evolutionary biology, they're talking about multiple processes. Evolutionary psychology only talks about adaptations. And I begin to suspect that the proponents of evolutionary psychology are unaware of any of the other mechanisms behind evolutionary biology. It's kind of disappointing, actually. Okay, now you might say, well, this is an external source. What I've got down here that's completely unreadable, sorry, that's because it's very dense, but I'm giving the URL there. This is something called the evopsych fact, the frequently asked question about evolutionary psychology. It's written by a guy who's a fanatically pro-evolutionary psychology person. Every time I get into an argument with an evolutionary psychologist, they cite this. So this is kind of an authoritative source. It's a central source for understanding the whole concept, the whole discipline of evolutionary psychology. So I'm not making this stuff up, okay? I'm doing my damnedest to avoid citing a biased source. I'm going straight to the evolutionary psychology sources. And as I said, you can't read that there, but what I did is I just brought it up in my browser, and I told it to search for ADAPT, A-D-A-P-T. Okay. And you might be able to see, does this work? Yeah. You might be able to see there's little yellow things. Those are where that word has been highlighted all over the place. And I'm not just arbitrarily picking a chunk of this text for this. The entire thing is that way. It's all adaptations, 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 adaptations. And from what I told you earlier, that should be a warning signal to you. They don't talk about drift at all. They don't talk about mutations. They don't talk about any of the other phenomena. They don't talk about recombination. It's all adaptations. Where it's right there, it tells you this is a flawed premise. They're missing the boat on most of evolutionary biology. Now, this is, again, from a defender of evolutionary psychology. I'm trying so hard to be generous to them. And he says the foundation of the approach is very hard to disagree with. Tell me which you believe to be incorrect. So he's giving me a little syllogism here, and I'm supposed to tell him where he's going wrong. And the first one is, organs are complex functional adaptations, results of a selection process. Can you guess where I would say there's a flaw in his reasoning? Lots of features of organs are the consequence of adaptations, right? I would say 100%. If you look at the pancreas, the fact that it produces insulin was a product of evolutionary history. An evolutionary history not unique to humans, of course, an ancient bit of evolutionary history. But yeah, there are things that are consequences of that. Once again, I will point to the lovely shape of my nose. That wasn't necessarily a product of an adaptation. The fact that I have a nose, that I have functioning nostrils, yes. Again, though, it would have been, it's not a unique adaptation to humans, but the little details are often the product of chance and drift. I would also agree with this, brain is an organ. Therefore, if we can understand it in terms of the past, just as we do every part of the body, humans and other life forms on Earth, etc., yes, we could, but you can't do it by just saying it's all an adaptation. You have to recognize all the complex phenomena that drive evolutionary processes. So yeah, I was able to tell him, right, your first point is wrong. The rest we can ignore then, right? If it's a syllogism, if your premise is false, the rest of your conclusions are erroneous. Okay, now let's talk about some of the critiques of evolutionary psychology. Here's one. This is pointing out that evolutionary psychology would be a good strategy if these three criteria were satisfied. First one is that all traits are adaptations. As I just told you, no evolutionary biologist will accept that. Most traits are not adaptations. Some are. Some critical ones are. The traits to be given an adaptive explanation could be easily characterized. So look at the behavior of your brain. Has anybody here ever done anything stupid? Hands go up everywhere. Yes, some of you have. Maybe I have too. I would not argue that that was an adaptation, right? That what we often have is unconscious biases. We have accidents of our upbringing. We've got things that we were told that were false. There's lots of things that our brains do that are not adaptive, that don't really work very well. And so there's a lot of phenomena that we do that are hard to explain, in an easily characterized evolutionary framework. I would point to religion as an example. Here's this ubiquitous phenomenon. And you will often find arguments in the literature about the adaptive nature of religion. They're bullshit, okay? There is no good adaptive explanation for religion. And there doesn't have to be. We do lots of things. If you sit down and write poetry, what kind of weirdo ape are you? That's not adaptive at all. Same with religion. Okay, and it would also be a good explanatory strategy if it were really hard to come up with adaptive explanations. If it were difficult, if you had to really struggle and search through the data to come up with a possible explanation, and that was one of the only few explanations you could come up with, then it might be a useful strategy. However, it's not. It's really easy to come up with just so stories to explain why things are there. Okay, so if these criteria apply, then a plausible adaptive explanation of a trait would have a high probability of being correct. None of the three apply. Again, this is getting down to the roots of evolutionary biology. What are the mechanisms that drive evolution? If you know those, you say, well, those are all bogus. This doesn't work. Okay, and like it says here, there's nothing wrong in principle taking an evolutionary approach to human behavior or cognition. I agree with that. We should be taking an evolutionary approach to it. In practice, however, the impoverished view of evolution in psychology adopted by many evolutionary psychologists and the weakness of their empirical science is frankly rather embarrassing. By impoverished view of evolution, I refer specifically to the fact that they do not appreciate the breadth of the mechanisms that drive evolutionary processes. Okay, this is another problem. If you ever go and try and read some evolutionary psychology, you will run into this all over the place. Often it's grossly sexist. There is so much evopsych literature, and I'm not saying all of it, but there's an awful large proportion of it that is entirely about why women do what they do. What buttons can I push to make a woman have sex with me? That's an important question in evolutionary psychology. And like here, you see male mate preferences. This is from an online discussion, a study group of evolutionary psychology. There is no complementary female mate preferences section because apparently females do not have mate preferences. We just kind of come along and club desirable women over the head and drag them away by their hair or something. Something like that. But you'll see this all over the place. They completely ignore the complexity of human behavior. And there's a lot of focus, again, not exclusively. There are actually some interesting questions that get asked, but there's a lot of focus, embarrassing focus, on why women are the way they are. Okay. Now for a little change in discussion. We've bashed evolutionary psychology enough. I want to talk about another misconception about evolution, and that is that there is this kind of crude idea of what evolution is all about. It's all about violence and death and killing your opponents and succeeding through competition, which appeals very strongly to a capitalistic culture like ours. And in fact, when you look at the history of evolutionary history, which you find, or evolutionary biology, what you find is there's early on a lot of support for it from, I'll use this word, the bourgeois community, right? That Karl Marx himself accused Darwin of being just an English shopkeeper because of the way he thought about how the world worked. You know, not to entirely endorse that, but yeah, there's a grain of truth to it. The Victorian England loved evolutionary biology because it could be used to endorse the predatory practices of colonialism and capitalism and all these other lovely things that made people rich. But it's also rife in religion. And unfortunately, this is partly cut off. Let me see. Oh no, I can't read that, gotcha. Anyway, there's the usual argument cut off there at the top that if you know the quote.
Evolution is true that people are animals and animals are people and bestiality is acceptable.
Why did you memorize that? Yeah, these are really familiar concepts. They're all over the place. I didn't remember the details. I'm glad somebody did. So then, and there's the argument here, atheistic evolution have difficulty accounting for altruism. Where do love and philanthropy come from? Down here he says, Charles Darwin declared there's no fundamental difference between man and the higher mammals and their mental faculties. Lions aren't plagued by guilt after killing a gazelle. Dogs don't experience remorse after stealing a bone from one of its peers. So how could we have evolved this sort of thing? This person apparently does not know much about dogs. We all know a dog's guilty look, right? We've seen this. And we've also seen dogs exhibit empathy. Cats, no. But dogs, yes. So we know that, we understand that there can be an evolutionary basis for a lot of these behaviors that we consider quite valuable, like empathy. This is the Answers in Genesis version of evolution. I love this slide. This is their entire explanation for how evolution works. Kill, attack, kill, bite, et cetera, club. And nowadays, murder and guns and things, that's all driving evolution. It's a very one-dimensional view of evolution. Not only that everything's driven by natural selection, but that natural selection only works one way, by the extermination of the least fit. And we can blame another Victorian for this, Herbert Spencer, who formulated that idea of that evolution is survival of the fittest. Again, the British loved this idea. They usually turned it around. I'm alive and I'm fit, therefore I'm the best, right? England is ruling the world, therefore we're the best. America, manifest destiny. We've beaten up all those brown people, therefore we are the best. And on top of that, we've enslaved all those black people, therefore we must be, because of natural selection and evolution, we must be superior to them. You heard this kind of thing all the time when you read the history of these ideas. But I want to make the point that no, that's not entirely true. It's also the case, just so you don't think it's all just creationists and wackos who think this. This is Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem, Nature red in tooth and claw. When you read a lot of the fun pop science stuff, you often see this stuff of dinosaurs fighting. There's always the scene of the Tyrannosaurus and the Triceratops battling it out, right? Because that's cool. That would make such a great Michael Bay movie. There's all kinds of stuff like that out there. So this is rife in the literature as well, that what's going on in the history of life is this eternal struggle, things battling it out and fighting. But there's lots of counterexamples against that. Anybody know what this is? Oh yeah, Manitoba, you're nowhere near the ocean. That's a barnacle, yes. So we're looking at a barnacle there. And barnacles are these crustaceans. They have this feeding apparatus. It's like a little feather that they just reach out and they filter particles from the ocean water. What do you think this is? Yes, that's a barnacle penis. They're really impressive. So they've got these gigantic penises because, barnacles don't get to leave home, right? They're stuck. They're encrusted in rock in little clumps. And it turns out if you want to mate with your neighbors, an efficient way to have it is a gigantic penis that can reach over to the next block and find a neighbor, right? So that's what they do. Now, does this sound like the kind of thing that arose by violence? No. Barnacles are the descendants of a long line of extremely successful lovers. That's their history, that love is love. If we equate sex with love, all right, that's a little bit of a reach, I know. But if we do that, then what you would say in barnacle evolution is no, what was really important is sex. That's what drove the development of this particular phenomenon. So there's lots of examples like that in biology. I'm going to mention a more obscure one. I'm sorry, we're getting away from penises. Oh. But this one is pretty cool too. This is about endosymbiosis. Let me ask, who's heard of the endosymbiote theory of evolution? A few of you. Oh boy, I'm teaching you new things. Okay, endosymbiosis refers to how our cells arose. That you all know that there's bacterial cells, right? So they're like E. coli is a prokaryote. It's a simple bacterium. It doesn't have a nucleus. It's got no complex organelles. It's a fairly simple organ. When you look at our cells, however, we find all these organelles inside the cells. We find this nicely encapsulated nucleus. We find ribosome, well, there's ribosomes in prokaryotes too. We find all these vesicles and various specialized functions. And in particular, we find these things like mitochondria, which, okay, do you remember from high school science, what are mitochondria? Power plant of the cell. Yes, that's one thing everybody learns from their biology classes is, mitochondria, the power plant of the cell. And this is giving you way more details than you need. But anyway, this is a mitochondrion over here. And what there is a symbiotic interaction between the nuclei of our cells and the mitochondria. The nuclei contain many useful genes. They provide all kinds of nutrients that the mitochondria use to generate energy, to generate ATP, if you all remember that from high school. So this is the power plant of the cell. It's busy making lots and lots of ATP through chemical processes that you don't need to know for today. But yes, if you were in my class, you would have a test, and we'd go over this. But anyway, so they make all this ATP. There's an exchange of signals and nutrients between the cell proper and the mitochondrial organelle, which is kind of cool. Where did these come from? We actually know the history of these things. It turns out that this is the product of cooperation in evolution, not competition. That what happened is you had cells that had little chambers inside that built vesicles, little infoldings of membrane, and then there were other bacteria that took up residence inside. So what you had is roughly 2 billion years ago, there was small bacteria that colonized large bacteria, and we don't know exactly what the relationship was. There's a couple of different competing hypotheses here that the big proto-eukaryotic cell was eating things. It was engulfing them, and they got taken up, and some of them were enslaved to work and make ATP for them. The other hypothesis, of course, is that no, it wasn't a matter of engulfment. It was that the other bacteria saw this was a pleasant place to live. There's lots of good things to eat inside of a cell, and so they lived there and they developed a symbiotic relationship. Anyway, those organs then became our mitochondria. And we can actually see traces of bacterial DNA, for instance, in each of our mitochondria. Plants also adopted an organ called the chloroplast, which they use for photosynthesis. So there were multiple instances of this kind of cooperation going on. So once again, let's undercut this idea that the only way you have progress in evolution is through violence and fighting and competing. This is a beautiful case of cooperation. It's also created a lot of capability for us. And once again, this is a complicated slide, and I won't go over all the details, but I will cite this guy, Nick Lane and Bill Martin, are two people who've been doing a lot of amazing work on this. They're one of my favorite authors to read now in the science literature, two of my favorite authors. And what they've been pointing out is that mitochondria are really good. They're specialized. They're specialized for producing energy. So you don't just have a generalized cell that also incidentally has to produce energy. You have a generalized cell containing multiple instances of little power plants that are just specifically sitting there to produce ATP. And what that means is that eukaryotes like us produce much, much more energy per nucleus than something like E. coli. That our cells are just spilling over with excess energy, which is great because what it's done is it's allowed the genomes of these eukaryotes to expand greatly. And what this is not a case of adaptation. What this is that we have so much excess energy for our genome that it allows us to tolerate the passive expansion of our genomes by things like genetic drift. So much of the detail of our genomes is actually not adaptive. It was produced because we got so much ATP pouring into our cells that we can do anything we want, including being really wasteful. Our cells are like Americans, just everything's pouring in there and we can do whatever we want. And so a lot of it is wasteful junk, but that junk accumulates and sometimes that junk has useful purposes. Okay, let me talk about another example. This is early in the evolution of animal forms. You're putting a limit on me. Okay, I'll be fine. I'm doing good. Okay. In the Cambrian, we had the evolution of this radical new life form, worms. Worms are amazing things, that they do all kinds of cool stuff. Our distant ancestors at this time, roughly 600 million years ago, were all worms. Aren't you proud of that fact? This is a cartoon from Punch of Darwin, and he's contemplating the evolution of life. So we're working backwards here. So there's modern humans, there's cavemen, there's monkeys or whatever these things are, going back to reptiles, and it all goes back to worms. We're all coming from worms, which we're very proud of. Because worms did a lot. One of the things that worms are responsible for is something called the bioturbation revolution. Once again, we're not talking about competition, battle, anything like that. We're talking about cooperation among multiple species to change the world. And they did. They changed the world in a very radical way. You know, I like to use this as an example when people tell me that, well, human beings couldn't possibly be changing the atmosphere. And I tell them, no, yes they can, because worms did it. Are you more powerful than a worm? No. Anyway. So what was the bioturbation revolution about? 600 million years ago, if you went to planet Earth and looked, the oceans were kind of bland and boring. There were mats of algae. There was lots of sediment piling up. This would get disrupted by storms every once in a while, but otherwise there was this gradual accumulation of just gunk and waste and sediment and things in the ocean floor. Then worms evolved. What worms do is they dig down into that sediment and they churn it. And they take all the buried nutrients down in the sediment and they bring it to the surface. Does Manitoba have worms? They're not native, right? Most areas that were glaciated they do not have native worms right now. You have to import them. But if you're a farmer, if you're a gardener, you know worms are really useful to have in the garden because of what they do. They take that soil and they just churn it up for you and they bring nutrients to the surface and mix it all up for your plants and your tomatoes and all those things to take advantage of it. This is exactly what happened in the Precambrian. Worms evolved in this really boring environment that was stratified, very densely sedimented, with things growing on the surface all right, but this was no man's land down deep. And then worms come along and they start burrowing and they dig this is actually a fossil worm right here. They dig all this stuff and they churn it up and they suddenly release all these nutrients into the water. There are multiple explanations for the Cambrian explosion, but this is one of them. Changes in the atmosphere, changes in the availability of nutrients in the ocean. And worms were responsible for that. So thank a worm next time you see one. You wouldn't be here without one. Anyway, this led to the Cambrian, which is this really rich fauna that then evolved. Lots of swimming things and strange creatures all over the place. But these organisms are all relying on churned up release of nutrients that were no longer getting trapped in sediments, but now being released into the ocean. And it's the same nowadays. Again, Manitoba, I'm sorry, you don't have an ocean, but if you go to the ocean, yeah, take a visit to the ocean. And what you'll discover is that there's areas where there's lots of deposits of sediment, and they're kind of dead and boring, and there's other places where you find lots of worms and clams and barnacles and things churning things up, and those tend to be much more lively. This also led to this phenomenon. Okay, any biologists here? One biologist. Oh, we need to recruit more of you. Young people become biologists. One of the common things that you learn about in biology is this. This is called a food web. And what you discover is that if you have complex food webs, you get much more diversity because you are much more efficiently exploiting the available niches and the nutrients in the environment. That if you want lots of living things, you can't do it with a monoculture, okay? You can't come into a region of the ocean, this is from the ocean again. You can't go in and say, oh, well, I just like salmon, and I like plankton to feed the salmon, so I will just have those two things in the environment. It won't work. Okay, there's not enough complexity there, not enough cooperative interactions to keep that life going. So things will die out on you. You need this whole complex web for it all to work. This also leads to one of my favorite authors, Peter Kropotkin, who was a contemporary of Charles Darwin, who made a number of really good arguments. He's arguing, for instance, that the animal species in which individual struggle has been reduced, that is, where you have less fighting and argument and competition and killing and murder and things in a species, the practice of mutual aid, which is his words for cooperation, has attained the greatest development, are invariably the most numerous, the most prosperous, and the most open to further progress. So this is a lesson from the natural world for us human beings. And it kind of makes sense, right? Less killing, less competition, more cooperation, and you get these good things. You get more numerous, you get more prosperous, you get more progress. So Kropotkin is on the side of progressive, liberal evolution and biology and science and everything, so we're all for it. I'll quickly mention a few other examples of cooperation. You all saw the March of the Penguins, right? That movie? Yeah, you must remember that part where all the penguins gather together on the ice shelf, the male penguins, and then they go through a mad rampage and kill each other until only one is left alive, right? You don't remember that part? Yeah, because it wasn't there. Instead, what you found is all these penguins are gathering in this huddle to keep each other warm. And they take turns who's going to be on the outside. They're constantly shuffling around to the center to warm up, and then on the outside to shelter the others. It's this wonderful example of cooperation. It's going on all the time. If they did fight Mad Max style for survival, there would be no penguins today. They'd all be dead because they'd kill each other until one was left and then it would freeze to death. We can also look at our nearest relatives, the chimpanzees and the bonobos. Incredibly cooperative animals, right? They spend a lot of time sitting around in their tribes. There's also some intertribal conflicts and things like this, but they spend a lot of time just hanging out, grooming each other, picking nits off of each other. Grooming is a big thing. This is something important for human beings too. We love hugs. We love getting together with people we love. This is how we survive as human beings. One last example I'll mention. This is another revolution that has occurred. These are baboons. Yes, we don't normally think of baboons as lovely animals, but they've got some cool attributes. One is that they live in troops of 50 to 250 individuals. So this is about the right size for a baboon troop, right? So here we are. Just imagine yourself a baboon troop, and you're all getting along just fine. But now you expand that baboon troop to larger sizes. The population in the U.S., 3 times, 10 to the 8th people live in the United States. I'm sorry I didn't get Canada's numbers here. The European Union, 5 times, and China, 1.3 times, 10 to the 9th people live in China. Can you imagine taking even 1,000 baboons and putting them in this room? What would happen? Boy, Donna would have to pay a security bill to the hotel that would just blow you away, right? So they would tear things up, they'd fight, that there would be these complex, nasty interactions with each other. Human beings, one of our key innovations, one of the things that we have evolved that's really special is the ability to cooperate in large groups. That we can get together in massively large groups and usually not end up killing each other. Baboons could not. So there's the world, 7 times 10 to the 9th people. Key to that is cooperation, living together peacefully. Wish we had more of it. Okay, so anyway, final lessons. Make love, not war is a perfectly reasonable evolutionary strategy. So all of you go home after this, make love. It's all good. Competition does help. There are cases where competition is a powerful force. It hones, but cooperation was what really creates revolutions. That the evolution of multicellularity, the evolution of mitochondria, that biotemperation revolution that changed the world, all of those things were radical changes driven by cooperative processes. Life can change the world. If a worm can do it, so can you. Diversity is richer than uniformity. That if you want to be strong as a group, you need diversity. Developing a monoculture is the way to failure and death. And this is the secret of our evolutionary success. It's social networks, it's getting together in nice meetings like this and having conversations and learning things from each other. Okay, I'm out of time, I bet. I have 5 minutes for questions. Make them easy.
Is it on? Okay. The question is, do you think the human species will eventually speciate to the point where liberals and conservatives will no longer be able to interbreed? And if not, do you have a theory about how the human species might eventually speciate?
Right. In order to speciate, you need a reproductive barrier of some sort. So yes, if Donald Trump builds a wall, then we'll split the North American continent into us guys. Well, they're also proposing building a wall across Canada. So yeah, it could happen. We could isolate America, and then we could become unable to interbreed with Canadians, and then that would happen. But it's really unlikely. Walls are easy to get around. So that's the key thing. You need the reproductive barrier, and there's no such reproductive barrier in human populations. In fact, we will mate with any other human from anywhere else on the planet without any kind of compunction. So.
I apologize. I am relatively uneducated in all of this. One of the things when I have to get into a discussion about evolution with my creationist friends is they bring up the entropy, and I don't understand enough about it to make an argument against it, and I wonder if you have maybe a simple explanation for me about why that's crap, because.
You want a simple explanation? Okay, so why is it crap? Well, a simple example is think of a watermill, right? A watermill is driven by water falling down through the veins and turning the wheel, and you extract energy from it. That does not violate any law of thermodynamics, right? Because what you're doing is just converting a fraction of one form of energy, the potential energy of falling water, into another form of energy, which may be grinding grain or driving a turbine and making electricity, whatever. So there's no violation of the law of thermodynamics there. When you look at living forms, they're doing exactly the same thing. That inside the mitochondria, the way the mitochondria work, is it's actually got a little protein that acts just like a windmill or watermill, in that protons flow across it, make it spin, and it drives the production of energy. So if you're going to argue that a watermill violates the law of thermodynamics, then you could make this case. But no, it's exactly the same thing, where we're just taking one form of energy and rather inefficiently converting it into chemical energy in our cells with a net loss of energy. Thermodynamics is fine. I don't know if that was simple enough, but it's, yeah. Okay. Yeah, if entropy didn't work, then babies wouldn't grow up to be adults, right? That's another counterexample is, are they violating the laws of thermodynamics? No, they're not, because they are eating all this food and pooping it out, right? So it's perfectly thermodynamically stable, yeah.
I like the idea that a huge genome is now possible because of excess energy. But one thing, another creationist argument, this idea that no new information ever comes. How would you respond to that?
That we have lots of examples of new information coming in. You know, we've documented them both with, we do molecular paleontology now. We reconstruct ancient genomes and ask what happened to them. And for instance, in our history, the history of tetrapods, these four-limbed animals that we are, there were 2 cases where we had whole genome duplications. This was, each time you do that, you double the amount of information in the genome. There is nothing to block that. It happens. It's perfectly reasonable. Anytime we have a single gene duplicating itself, there's lots of examples of this. If you read the genetics literature, you can find all kinds of examples. I bet if I took apart your genome, I would find cases where you had duplications of genes that I don't have, and some where I have duplications that you don't have. So that each of those represents an increase in information by any measure, and there's nothing in how genetics works, how molecules work to prohibit it. There's somebody way back there?
Easy, I just had a quick one. Is it true you're going to interbreed with Ken Ham?
There's a little problem that our parts don't match. He doesn't produce ova, and neither do I, which means we just can't. Could I take Ken Ham? I could take Ken Ham in an intellectual fight, but that would be unfair. Okay, thank you very much.
That was wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks.